Washington, D.C., May 15, 1951. The air in the Senate chamber is electric. A national hero, General Douglas MacArthur, has been fired, and the nation is in an uproar. Now a quiet five-star general, Omar Bradley, is about to speak. In his briefcase are the secrets of the Pentagon, the fears of the White House, and a strategy that could avert World War III. The world holds its breath. Will he support his old comrade? Or will he deliver the verdict that changes history forever? To understand the weight of this moment, we must go back to a time when victory seemed not only possible, but inevitable. Less than a year earlier, the Korean peninsula was a landscape of desperation. A surprise invasion from the north had shattered the South Korean army, pushing beleaguered American and UN forces into a tiny, desperate pocket around the port of Busan. The free world watched, fearing the first domino of the Cold War was about to fall. Into this crisis stepped General Douglas MacArthur, a figure who seemed more myth than man. As Supreme Commander of the Allied powers in Japan, he was the modern proconsul of the Pacific. His masterful amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950 was a stroke of strategic genius, a gamble of breathtaking audacity that shattered the North Korean army and reversed the entire course of the war. UN forces surged north, liberating Seoul and crossing the 38th parallel. The war, it seemed, was all but won. MacArthur's confidence was absolute. He famously promised the troops they would be home by Christmas. His armies, a coalition from across the globe, drove relentlessly towards the Yalu River, the natural border separating Korea from mainland China. The momentum was intoxicating, a triumphant march to eradicate a communist threat. But in the corridors of power in Washington, a deep unease was setting in. Intelligence reports, though fragmented and often dismissed by MacArthur's headquarters, spoke of a ghost army gathering in the Manchurian highlands. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, veterans of their own brutal civil war, were massing just across the river. President Truman and his Joint Chiefs of Staff, including Omar Bradley, sent cautious warnings, urging restraint. This was supposed to be a limited war, a police action to restore a border, not a crusade to conquer a continent. The general on the ground, however, saw things differently. He viewed the warnings as timid, the sign of a political leadership that lacked the will for total victory. He pushed his men onward, deep into the frozen, mountainous terrain of North Korea. Their supply lines stretched thin, their guard let down by the promise of a swift conclusion. Then, in late November of 1950, the ghost became real. The night erupted with the sound of bugles, a chilling alien sound to the Western soldiers. Waves of Chinese troops, who had infiltrated the mountains undetected, crashed down upon the unsuspecting UN columns. It was a strategic masterstroke of surprise and overwhelming numbers. The home by Christmas offensive turned into a desperate, freezing retreat. At places like the Chosin Reservoir, American Marines found themselves surrounded, outnumbered 10-1, fighting not just a new, determined enemy, but also the brutal Korean winter. The war was no longer about liberating Korea. It was about survival. Suddenly, the entire strategic calculus had changed. What began as a mission to contain communism on a peninsula now threatened to ignite a full-scale war with Red China, a nation of nearly 500 million people. For MacArthur, every soldier, every plane, every ship committed to an expanded war in Asia was one less resource available to defend Europe from the Soviet Union. This was the heart of the disagreement, a fundamental clash of worldviews that set a five-star general on a collision course with his commander-in-chief. This was the conflict that led to a single, shocking headline on April 11th, 1951. Truman fires MacArthur. The decision ignited a political firestorm. MacArthur returned home to a hero's welcome, with ticker-tape parades and a powerful address to Congress. He was the defiant warrior, betrayed by weak-willed politicians. Truman's approval ratings plummeted. And now the administration's fate, and its entire global strategy, rested on the testimony of the one man respected enough to counter the legend, General Omar Bradley. When General MacArthur testified before the Senate Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees, beginning on May 3, 1951, he wasn't just a soldier explaining his actions. He was a living icon presenting a vision. For 3 days, he held the nation spellbound, painting a picture of a war that could be decisively won, and a communist threat that could be permanently crippled in Asia. His testimony was a masterclass in military oratory, rooted in a simple, powerful message. There is no substitute for victory. He argued that the very concept of a limited war was a dangerous fallacy. To fight with one hand tied behind your back, he contended, was to invite a bloody, protracted stalemate, sacrificing American lives for an unclear political objective. The core of his strategy was a three-pronged offensive against China itself. First, he called for a naval blockade of the entire Chinese coast. This was economic warfare on a grand scale, designed to starve the burgeoning Chinese war machine of essential materials. Second, and most controversially, he demanded the authority to launch airstrikes against military bases and industrial centers in Manchuria. From his perspective on the battlefield, this was simple military logic. The armies pouring across the Yalu River were being supplied, equipped, and reinforced from these Manchurian sanctuaries. To forbid attacking these supply hubs was, in his view, an act of strategic insanity. It was like allowing a boxer to retreat to his corner to recover and rearm between every round, unopposed. The third pillar of his plan was to unleash the nationalist Chinese forces of Chiang Kai-shek, who were exiled on the island of Formosa, now known as Taiwan. He envisioned these hundreds of thousands of seasoned anti-communist troops opening a second front on the Chinese mainland, forcing Beijing to divert its armies away from Korea. To MacArthur, this was a straightforward plan to apply overwhelming pressure and force a collapse. He presented it as the only logical path forward, the only way to honor the sacrifices already made. He dismissed the fears of a wider war as appeasement. To the American public, reeling from the shock of the Chinese intervention and the mounting casualties, his words were a clarion call for decisive action. He was the old soldier who knew how to win, being hamstrung by politicians who lacked his clarity and courage. But inside the Pentagon, a very different picture was being analyzed. The men who would have to execute MacArthur's plan, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, viewed his strategy not with admiration, but with profound alarm. These were not timid men. Chairman Omar Bradley had commanded the 12th Army Group in Europe, over 1.3 million soldiers, the largest single American field command in history. General J. Lawton Collins, the Army Chief of Staff, had led the charge on the Normandy beaches and the breakout from St. Lo. General Hoyt Vandenberg, the Air Force Chief, had commanded the 9th Air Force, providing the air cover for the D-Day invasion. Admiral Forrest Sherman, Chief of Naval Operations, was a brilliant naval aviation strategist in the Pacific. They, along with Secretary of Defense George Marshall, the architect of victory in World War II, saw a world of interconnected threats that MacArthur, from his Tokyo headquarters, seemed to ignore. They were playing on a global chessboard, and they believed MacArthur was fixated on a single square, oblivious to the checkmate it could trigger. Their primary concern was not China. It was the Soviet Union. To them, the Korean conflict, brutal as it was a secondary theater. The main event, the potential World War III, would be fought on the plains of Europe. Committing the bulk of American air and naval power to a war with China would leave a recovering Western Europe dangerously exposed to the massive Soviet Red Army. It would, in their view, be a catastrophic diversion of strength, playing directly into Joseph Stalin's hands. He could watch his two greatest rivals, the United States and China, bleed each other dry in Asia, leaving him the undisputed master of the Eurasian landmass. The stage was set for a monumental confrontation of ideas. It was MacArthur's regional victory at all costs strategy versus the Joint Chiefs' global containment-focused realism. And Omar Bradley was the man chosen to articulate it. On May 15th, when Omar Bradley took his seat before the senators, the atmosphere was starkly different from MacArthur's theatrical appearance. MacArthur had been the returning Caesar. Bradley was the quiet professional, the soldier's soldier. He spoke not in grand pronouncements, but in the measured, analytical tones of a strategist weighing immense risks. He began by systematically dismantling MacArthur's plan, not by attacking the man, but by exposing the dangerous flaws in his logic. Bradley's argument was built on a foundation of global reality. He laid out the Joint Chiefs' view of the world in 1951. America's military was a finite resource. After the massive demobilization following World War II, it was a shadow of its former self, now struggling to rearm in the face of new Cold War threats. The primary strategic priority, agreed upon by all of America's key allies, was the defense of Europe. This was not a matter of sentiment, but of cold, hard industrial and geopolitical fact. Western Europe represented the greatest concentration of industrial power outside of the United States and the Soviet Union. To lose it to Soviet domination would be an irreversible blow to the global balance of power. Every bomber wing sent to Manchuria, Bradley explained, was a bomber wing not available to deter a Soviet push through the Fulda Gap. A naval blockade of China would tie down the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, leaving the vital North Atlantic sea lanes, the lifeline to Europe, vulnerable. The alliance that America had painstakingly built to contain Soviet expansionism, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was the cornerstone of this strategy. And this alliance, Bradley warned, was fragile. America's NATO partners viewed MacArthur's proposals with absolute terror. They had just begun to rebuild from the ashes of one world war and had no intention of being dragged into a third over a conflict on the far side of the globe. They saw MacArthur's plan as a reckless gamble that would provoke the Soviet Union, with whom China had recently signed a treaty of mutual assistance. If America became embroiled in a full-scale war with China, would the Soviets honor their treaty? It was a risk the Joint Chiefs and America's allies were unwilling to take. An American war with China, Bradley testified, would shatter the NATO alliance, leaving the United States isolated on the world stage, fighting a massive land war in Asia, while its primary adversary remained untouched and strengthened. This was the context for his most famous and most devastating assessment of MacArthur's strategy. Looking directly at the senators, his calm demeanor giving his words immense power, he delivered the verdict. An expanded war with China would involve the United States in, as he put it, the wrong war at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. The phrase was a rhetorical kill shot. In one simple, devastating sentence, he crystallized the entire strategic opposition to MacArthur's plan. The wrong war, because it was a massive land war in Asia, the kind of conflict military strategists had warned against for decades. The wrong place, because it diverted American strength from the Central Theater, Europe. The wrong time, because the U.S. military was not yet rebuilt to the strength required for such a global conflict. And, most critically, the wrong enemy. He clarified that the principal antagonist to the free world was not Red China, a regional power, however formidable. The primary enemy, the only nation with the industrial and military might to truly threaten the United States, was the Soviet Union. By focusing American fury on China, MacArthur was, in Bradley's view, taking his eyes off the real threat. He was proposing to wrestle with the organ grinder's monkey, while the organ grinder himself watched with amusement, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This testimony fundamentally shifted the nature of the debate. It was no longer a question of one general's courage versus politicians' cowardice. It was now a clear-eyed debate about global strategy, about resource allocation, and about identifying the primary threat in a world shadowed by the atomic bomb. Bradley's testimony was the centerpiece, but he was not alone. One by one, the other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of Defense George Marshall came forward to reinforce his message. Each man brought the unique perspective of his service, creating a unified and overwhelming case against MacArthur's Asian First strategy. Their collective testimony was a powerful affirmation of a crucial democratic principle that had been thrown into question: civilian control over the military. General J. Lawton, Lightning Joe Collins, the Army Chief of Staff, spoke with the blunt pragmatism of a ground commander. He addressed the immense human cost of expanding the war. An invasion of mainland China, or even a protracted bombing campaign, would require a massive mobilization of American manpower. He painted a grim picture of a quagmire, a war of attrition against a nation that could absorb staggering losses. Where would these troops come from? The divisions earmarked for the defense of Europe. Collins made it clear that from the Army's perspective, MacArthur's plan was a recipe for bleeding America's ground forces white in a secondary theater, for casualties that would dwarf the Korean conflict, all while the real danger in Europe grew. Next came General Hoyt Vandenberg, the Chief of Staff of the fledgling United States Air Force. His testimony was a crucial dose of reality that punctured the myth of a quick, clean victory through air power. MacArthur and his supporters envisioned American bombers leveling Chinese cities and industries with impunity. Vandenberg, whose entire career was built on the strategic use of air power, explained that it was not that simple. The Chinese Air Force, while nascent, was already being equipped with modern Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters. Bombing Manchuria, he argued, would trigger a massive air war. To win that war and protect the bombers, the U.S. Air Force would have to commit the majority of its strategic air command. He stated plainly that the Air Force was a shoestring operation, still building its strength. A full-scale air war with China would decimate its capabilities, leaving little in reserve to counter the Soviet Union's formidable air fleets. He famously concluded that an all-out air assault on China would be a misuse of air power, leaving the U.S. in a rat hole, with the door slammed shut behind it. Admiral Forrest Sherman, the Chief of Naval Operations, completed the picture from the sea. A naval blockade, he explained, sounded simple, but was an act of total war that would be difficult and resource-intensive to enforce along China's vast coastline. More importantly, It would likely bring the U.S. Navy into direct conflict with the Soviet Navy, particularly around strategic ports like Dalian, which the Soviets were using. Was a confrontation over a Korean border dispute worth risking a naval battle with the Soviet Union? Sherman's answer was an unequivocal no. The U.S. Navy's primary mission was to keep the sea lanes to Europe open, not to strangle a secondary adversary in the Pacific. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from Secretary of Defense George Marshall. A figure of immense bipartisan respect, Marshall was the man who had overseen the entire American victory in World War II. He spoke not just as a cabinet secretary, but as a revered elder statesman of military affairs. He calmly and methodically dismantled MacArthur's core charge, that the Joint Chiefs' caution was a new policy, a betrayal of America's traditional commitment to total victory. Marshall produced documents and minutes from meetings showing that the strategy of limited war in Korea had been established and communicated to MacArthur from the very beginning. He revealed that MacArthur himself had previously agreed that involving the Soviet Union in the conflict was the greatest danger to be avoided. Marshall's testimony was devastating because it reframed the narrative. The issue was not a lack of will in Washington. It was a consistent strategic policy that General MacArthur had come to openly and repeatedly defy. This was insubordination, a direct challenge to the authority of the President as Commander-in-Chief. The combined weight of these testimonies was immense. They presented a united front from the nation's entire military and defense leadership. It was no longer one general against the president. It was now one general against the entire established command structure of the United States Armed Forces. The A-bomb, the ultimate weapon, hovered like a ghost over the entire debate. In the public's mind, and certainly in MacArthur's, America held a trump card, its nuclear arsenal. If the United States could bring an empire like Japan to its knees with just 2 bombs, why couldn't it force a swift conclusion in China? This question was at the heart of the popular support for MacArthur's aggressive stance. He himself had spoken of creating a radioactive cordon of cobalt across the neck of Manchuria, a chilling vision of using tactical nuclear weapons to permanently seal the border. To a public unfamiliar with the terrifying new logic of the nuclear age, this seemed like a powerful, if extreme, solution. However, Bradley and the Joint Chiefs understood a terrifying reality that was only beginning to dawn on the world. America's nuclear monopoly was over. In 1949, the Soviet Union had successfully detonated its own atomic bomb, fundamentally changing the global strategic landscape forever. The world had entered an age of mutual vulnerability. Using the atomic bomb was no longer a one-sided decision with guaranteed results. It was now a move that could trigger a cataclysmic, two-way exchange. The Joint Chiefs were forced to contemplate the unthinkable. What would happen if the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Chinese cities? First, they calculated the military effectiveness. While devastating, dropping a few atomic bombs on a country as vast as China, with its dispersed, largely agrarian population and industry, would not necessarily be a war-winning blow. It would cause immense destruction and civilian casualties, but it might not cripple the Chinese army's ability to fight in Korea. Second, and far more importantly, they weighed the geopolitical fallout. An atomic attack on China, an ally of the Soviet Union, would be the ultimate provocation. How would Stalin react? Would he see it as a prelude to an attack on Russia itself? Would he feel compelled by treaty or by strategic necessity to retaliate? The terrifying possibility was a Soviet nuclear strike on American allies in Europe, on London, Paris, or West Berlin, or even on American bases in Japan or Alaska. This was the nightmare scenario that kept the Joint Chiefs awake at night. MacArthur's plan, taken to its nuclear conclusion, risked turning the limited war in Korea into the opening salvo of a global thermonuclear holocaust. It was a gamble of civilization-ending proportions, and for what? To achieve an unconditional surrender in a regional conflict that did not directly threaten the survival of the United States. Bradley and his colleagues made it clear in their closed-door sessions that the atomic bomb was not a usable weapon in this context. It was a weapon of deterrence, a tool to prevent a world war with the Soviet Union, not an oversized artillery shell to be used tactically in Asia. Its power was so absolute that it had become, paradoxically, almost unusable, except in the most extreme case of national survival. This secret, existential dread informed every aspect of their testimony. When they spoke of limited war, they were not advocating for a lack of resolve. They were articulating a new, terrifyingly delicate doctrine for survival in the nuclear age. They were trying to manage a conflict in a way that would not light the fuse to World War III. This was a nuance that was difficult to communicate to a public accustomed to the clear-cut, total victory narrative of World War II. MacArthur's message was simple and emotionally resonant. Win. The Joint Chiefs' message was complex and grim. Survive. They had to explain that in a world with two nuclear powers, sometimes the greatest victory is not winning a war, but preventing a far larger one. The principle of civilian control over the military was the final, crucial battleground of the hearings. MacArthur's public defiance of the president's orders was a direct challenge to the American constitutional system. If a popular general could override the elected commander-in-chief and dictate foreign policy, then the United States was on a dangerous path. George Marshall, in his testimony, put it plainly. The issue was whether the U.S. would be governed by its elected officials or by its military commanders. The heart of the conflict between MacArthur and Truman was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the war itself, rooted in their personal experiences and geographic perspectives. MacArthur was a man of the Pacific. His entire career, his greatest triumphs, and his deepest understanding of conflict were forged in Asia. From the Philippines to Japan, he saw the world through the lens of a Pacific theater commander. To him, the rise of communism in China was the single greatest threat to American interests, a direct challenge to the order he had helped build from the ashes of World War II. He viewed Europe as a distant problem, a continent that was, for the moment, stable. The real immediate fire, in his estimation, was in Asia, and it needed to be extinguished with overwhelming force before it spread. He saw the Korean War not as a limited border dispute, but as the decisive battleground in a global ideological struggle against communism, and China was its frontline champion. His insubordination, in his own mind, was not a betrayal of his country, but a desperate attempt to awaken it to what he saw as the true danger. He believed the politicians in Washington, thousands of miles away, were blind to the on-the-ground reality and the historic opportunity to roll back the red tide. President Truman and his advisors, including Bradley and Marshall, operated from a completely different worldview. They were Atlanticists, men whose strategic thinking had been shaped by two world wars that had originated in and been decided in Europe. They saw committing America's full might to a war in Korea would be, from their perspective, like a chess player focusing all his pieces on a single pawn while ignoring the fact that his king was in check on the other side of the board. This Europe-first strategy was not an arbitrary choice. It was a calculated assessment of global power dynamics. The final straw was not a single military disagreement, but an act of direct political sabotage. As the Truman administration was quietly working through diplomatic channels to initiate ceasefire talks, MacArthur, without authorization, issued his own ultimatum to the Chinese commander. It was a public statement full of belligerent rhetoric demanding an immediate surrender and threatening to expand the war. This act effectively torpedoed the administration's peace initiative. It was he knew it would unleash a storm of criticism, and it did. But he also knew that the fundamental principle of civilian control over the military was at stake. If he allowed a general to defy the elected government, the precedent would be catastrophic for American democracy. The Senate hearings, therefore, became the public trial for this momentous decision. It was a referendum not just on Korean war strategy, but on who ultimately directs the power of the American state. Omar Bradley's testimony was the turning point. By laying out the global strategic risks in such clear, sober terms, he gave political cover to senators who were hesitant to oppose a popular war hero. He demonstrated that the administration's policy was not born of weakness, but of a broader, more responsible strategic vision. He defended the president's authority not as a politician, but as the nation's highest-ranking military officer, affirming that in the American system, the generals advise, but the president decides. The Senate hearings did not end the war, but they fundamentally redefined its purpose and its end state. The grand, intoxicating vision of a total victory, a unified democratic Korea, and a defeated Red China was laid to rest. After the soldiers were fighting and dying for yards of barren, blood-soaked ground on hills with bleak, forgettable names like Porkchop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge. The shift in Washington meant that these men were no longer fighting for a decisive breakthrough. They were fighting to hold a line, to create leverage for the diplomats who began peace talks at Kaesong and later Panmunjom in July 1951. This was a psychologically grueling form of warfare. The sweeping advances and retreats of the war's first year were over. Now it was a war of patrols, ambushes, and relentless artillery barrages. A war of attrition where the only goal was to make the other side bleed more than you did. The knowledge that a final victory was off the table was deeply demoralizing. Soldiers questioned what they were fighting for. If the goal was simply to end up back where the war started, were their sacrifices and the lives of their fallen comrades meaningless? This sentiment echoed back home, where the American public grew weary of a war with no clear end in sight. The initial patriotic fervor following the North Korean invasion had faded, replaced by frustration over a bloody stalemate on the other side of the world. Yet the strategic logic articulated by Bradley and the Joint Chiefs held firm. The war in Korea was contained. It did not escalate into a direct conflict with China, nor did it trigger a Soviet intervention. The NATO alliance, though strained, remained intact. The defense of Europe was not compromised. The world did not slide into a Third World War. From the cold, detached perspective of global strategy, the policy was a success. The armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953, more than 2 years after the Senate hearings began. It was not a peace treaty, but a ceasefire. It left Korea divided, a nation permanently scarred, with a heavily fortified, demilitarized zone that remains one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints to this day. There were no victory parades for the veterans of the Korean War. They returned not to a grateful nation celebrating a great triumph, but to a country that was eager to forget what became known as the Forgotten War. They had fought a brutal conflict, achieved the stated political objective of saving South Korea, but were denied the satisfaction of a clear and total victory that the previous generation had experienced. The legacy of the MacArthur-Bradley confrontation was profound. It solidified the doctrine of limited war as a key tool of Cold War policy, a way to confront communist aggression without risking nuclear annihilation. It decisively reaffirmed the principle of civilian control over the military, establishing a clear line that no general since has dared to cross so openly. But it also left a lingering and complex question in the American psyche about the nature of war itself. Is a negotiated stalemate an acceptable outcome? When is the cost of total victory too high? Omar Bradley provided the answer for his time. He argued that in the nuclear age, the definition of victory had to change. Sometimes victory is not the unconditional surrender of the enemy. Sometimes it is the prevention of a far greater catastrophe. It is a lesson written in the cold mountains of Korea, a lesson that continues to shape American military and political strategy to this day. Let us pause and consider the two men at the center of this storm, two titans of American military history whose careers and philosophies could not have been more different. Douglas MacArthur was a figure seemingly sculpted for legend. Born into a military dynasty, his life was a tapestry of dramatic gestures and historic commands. He was theatrical, eloquent, and possessed an unshakable belief in his own destiny. His famous corncob pipe, his sunglasses, his uniquely styled cap, they were all part of a carefully cultivated image of a supreme commander, a proconsul who operated on a plane above mere mortals. His leadership style was autocratic and often distant. He preferred to command from a high headquarters, orchestrating grand strategic maneuvers like a conductor leading an orchestra. His daring landing at Incheon was the perfect expression of his military genius, a high-risk, high-reward operation that relied on boldness and surprise. He was a man who thought in terms of sweeping campaigns and unconditional surrenders. To him, war was an instrument for achieving absolute victory, and any political consideration that hindered that goal was an unacceptable constraint. He was in many ways a 19th century warrior, grappling with the complex, nuanced realities of a 20th century atomic world. His worldview was clear, his resolve absolute, and his inability to compromise was both his greatest strength and his ultimate undoing. Omar Bradley, by contrast, was the epitome of the unassuming professional. He was the GI's general, a man who rose not through flamboyant self-promotion, but through quiet competence and a profound understanding of the common soldier. Born to a poor family in rural Missouri, he never lost his connection to the men in the ranks. He was approachable, methodical, and deeply respected for his calm demeanor under pressure. Where MacArthur was the grand strategist, Bradley was the master tactician and logistician. His genius lay not in breathtaking gambles, but in the meticulous planning and coordination required to move and supply millions of soldiers, as he did in Europe. He understood that modern warfare was a colossal, industrial, and managerial enterprise. He was a coalition builder, skilled at the patient diplomacy required to hold together the often fractious alliance of World War II. He viewed war not as a personal crusade, but as a tool of national policy, to be used with caution and precision, always subordinate to the political objectives set by civilian leaders. He understood instinctively the global nature of the Cold War and the delicate balance of risks. He represented the new breed of American military leader, the soldier-statesman, who had to be as adept in the committee rooms of Washington as on the battlefields of Europe. The clash in 1951 was not just a disagreement over strategy. It was a collision of these two archetypes. It was the old world warrior versus the new world manager. MacArthur's defiant stand was the last great roar of a style of generalship that was becoming obsolete. In a world of global alliances, proxy wars, and nuclear brinksmanship, the lone, swashbuckling commander, however brilliant, was a liability. The future belonged to the Bradleys of the world, the careful, analytical professionals who could navigate the treacherous political and strategic currents of the Cold War. The Senate hearings were the formal stage where this transition was ratified. MacArthur's vision, rooted in the glorious certainties of past wars, was ultimately rejected in favor of Bradley's more sober, cautious, and globally aware approach. It was a pivotal moment marking the end of one era of American military command and the definitive beginning of another. The quiet man from Missouri had, through logic and reason, outmaneuvered the celebrated conqueror of the Pacific, setting the course for American military policy for the next generation. The outcome ensured that the final authority would rest not with the general in the field, no matter how revered, but with the elected officials who represented the will of the people. The repercussions of the Bradley-MacArthur hearings extended far beyond the Korean Peninsula and the careers of the two generals. The event served as a crucial public stress test for the American system of government, forcing a national conversation about the very nature of war in the modern age and the proper relationship between its civil and military leaders. It established precedents that would echo through every subsequent conflict, from Vietnam to the Gulf War and beyond. The most immediate and enduring legacy was the powerful reaffirmation of civilian control over the military. Before 1951, the principle was a constitutional given, but it had never been challenged so publicly by a figure of MacArthur's stature. The hearings and the ultimate public acceptance of Truman's decision cemented this principle as the bedrock of American civil-military relations. It sent an unmistakable message to all future military leaders. Your role is to advise and to execute, not to formulate national policy. The specter of MacArthur's dismissal would hang over every future disagreement between the Pentagon and the White House, serving as a powerful check on military overreach. This created a new dynamic for American generals. They had to become more politically astute, learning to navigate the corridors of power in Washington and build consensus for their strategies, rather than simply issuing commands from the field. Furthermore, the hearings forced the American public and its political leadership to grapple with the uncomfortable concept of limited war. This was a radical departure from the American tradition of total war, which aimed for the complete capitulation of the enemy, as seen in the Civil War and the two World Wars. The idea of fighting for limited objectives, of accepting a stalemate, was deeply unsatisfying and counterintuitive. Yet, Bradley's testimony successfully argued that in an age of nuclear weapons, total war between great powers was no longer a viable option. It was a form of mutual suicide. Limited war, therefore, became a necessary, if frustrating, tool of statecraft. The Korean War became the prototype for this new kind of conflict. It was a war fought not for conquest, but for signaling, for containment, for maintaining a balance of power. This doctrine would be applied with varying degrees of success and failure throughout the Cold War. The debates over escalation in Vietnam, for instance, were a direct echo of the arguments made in 1951. Policymakers and generals would repeatedly weigh the risks of expanding a conflict against the dangers of a wider war with the Soviet Union or China, often referencing the lessons learned from Korea. On a global scale, the outcome of the hearings reassured America's allies. The fear in London, Paris, and other NATO capitals was that the United States, under the influence of a figure like MacArthur, could be an unpredictable and reckless superpower liable to drag them into a catastrophic war over a peripheral interest. The reassertion of Truman's cautious Europe-first policy, so clearly articulated by Bradley and Marshall, stabilized the NATO alliance. It demonstrated that America's strategic focus remained on the containment of the Soviet Union, and that it would not unilaterally abandon its commitments in Europe. This helped solidify the alliance's cohesion during a critical period of Cold War tension. For the armed forces themselves, the hearings spurred a deeper integration of political and military planning. It was no longer enough to be a brilliant tactician. Senior officers were now expected to understand the broader geopolitical context of their actions. The National War College and other senior service schools began to place a greater emphasis on grand strategy, international relations, and the political implications of military force. The soldier had to be a statesman, and the statesman had to understand the limits and capabilities of his soldiers. The quiet Senate chamber in the spring of 1951 became the crucible in which the modern American way of war was forged. A complex, often frustrating, but ultimately pragmatic approach designed to navigate a world where the stakes had become nothing less than the survival of humanity. In the grand sweep of history, the confrontation between Douglas MacArthur and Omar Bradley was more than a clash of personalities. It was a defining moment for a young superpower grappling with its newfound global responsibilities. The United States emerged from World War II with unprecedented power, but it was a power that brought with it unprecedented dangers. The atomic bomb, a symbol of American might, was also a harbinger of potential global annihilation. The central question facing the nation was how to wield this immense power responsibly in a world fractured by a new and dangerous ideological conflict. MacArthur offered one answer: the path of decisive, overwhelming force. His was a vision of clarity and moral certainty, a belief that any challenge to American interests should be met and crushed with the full might of the nation's military. It was a vision rooted in the past, in a world where wars had clear beginnings, decisive battles, and triumphant conclusions. It appealed to the American desire for simple solutions and unambiguous victories. Bradley, on behalf of the Truman administration, offered a different, more complex answer: the path of prudence, containment, and calculated risk. This was a vision that acknowledged the terrifying new realities of the nuclear age. It accepted that some problems could not be solved by military force alone, that some victories were not worth the potential cost, and that the ultimate goal was not just to win wars, but to prevent the one war that could never be won, a global thermonuclear conflict. The Senate hearings of 1951 were the national forum where these two visions competed. In choosing Bradley's path, America made a deliberate decision about the kind of world power it would be. It chose to be the leader of a coalition, not a unilateral actor. It chose to prioritize the stability of the global system over the pursuit of total victory in a single theater. And it chose to bind its immense military power to the rule of law and the authority of its elected civilian leaders. The Korean War, the conflict at the heart of this debate, stands as a stark monument to this choice. it ended in a frustrating stalemate, a divided peninsula, and a forgotten legacy for its veterans. Yet it also succeeded in its primary objective. South Korea was saved from invasion and has since grown into a prosperous, democratic nation. A wider war with China and the Soviet Union was averted. The world pulled back from the brink. In the final analysis, Omar Bradley's famous words, "The wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy," were not an argument for inaction or appeasement. They were a profound statement of strategic priorities. They were an acknowledgement that in the high-stakes game of Cold War geopolitics, a nation must choose its battles wisely, conserve its strength for the main effort, and never lose sight of the ultimate threat. It was a hard lesson, learned in the crucible of a brutal, faraway war, and articulated not by a politician, but by a quiet, thoughtful soldier who understood that the greatest responsibility of a general is not just to win battles, but to safeguard the nation he serves from the abyss.